Today's episode features the return of the ravenous crack fiend on a mad quest to kill the old gods with exclusively stolen goods, as we hope to answer the question, can I beat Dark Souls 3 with only mimic drops? To get things going, I decide to make Cockfrey a herald because I like the cut of his jib, and then we spawn in and immediately drop all of his equipment. The premise of the run is pretty straightforward, but to make it completely clear, we do not use any weapon, armor, or ring that isn't dropped to us from a dead mimic. We need to find and kill every mimic in the game, plus every boss, and of course reach the end credits. No glitches or exploits. Which means that until we find our first mimic, we are naked and unarmed. And actually, outside of the symbol of avarice, which is that silly little hat that drains your health as you wear it, none of the mimics in this game drop any armor, so we are naked for good. Going into Gundyr, I'm a little worried about how long this might take, but he has some of the most generous parry timings in the game to help speed things up. And while Attempt 1 is ended by a minor disagreement with gravity, Attempt 2 goes buttery smooth, and after just under 5 minutes of haymakers, we get the no-hit finish. There's nothing much to do in Firelink outside of start leveling Vigor to counteract our lack of armor, so before long we're on Lothric's high wall making movement towards Mimic number 1, who likes to hang out in this little storage space underneath the dragon. I charge up a big attack to get a taste of our damage, and we're going to be here for a while. But despite a couple close calls, we clear the Mimic just fine and receive our first item, the Deep Battle Axe, known for its lack of scaling and emphasis on dark damage, which is a damage type that a lot of shit in this game is highly resistant to. But it's better than our hands. We keep pushing through the high wall, grabbing the Estus shard, Grey Rat Cell Key, and a couple Titanite shards so we can have a +1 weapon and a little more life juice when we go in to face Vort. And outside of me completely botching the heavy attack on the head, the fight goes how Vort fights usually go, and now we can get the banner from that piece of shit Priestess Emma and raise it to proceed on to the undead settlement. I kill these dogs because I hate them, and then I pick up free levels Yol because I'm actually allowed to use him this time. Moving through the area, I'm just focusing on grabbing the important resources and fighting whatever I have to along the way. In an attempt to stay embered for the time being, I completely ignore the Aldrich invasion, dodge the spears to grab the undead bone shard, and fight my way around to the door out of the village, only to realize that Aldrich is literally holding me hostage in the region. I'll be honest, I completely forgot that invasions do this, so I have to circle back through the sewers and let the old man do his worst. And while I tried to put up a good fight, we all knew how this would end. Our next life is simplicity itself, however, as we can beeline for the door, absolutely dunk on the Outrider Knight, and push on to the Road of Sacrifices, where I have a genuinely difficult time killing the thick queen with the butcher knife. I swear this doesn't usually happen, milady. And after that, it's on to the Crucifixion Woods, where I can swing by all the Titanite drops and the Estus shard, then perform the ladder trick before we find ourselves in Farron Keep. And outside of the couple easy-to-grab resources sitting around, we're really just focused on getting to the altars and reaching the tower. But I do have to stop and disrespect this poison guy here, because I feel that he's being a bit dramatic. Get a fucking grip. Then with 2 of our altars snuffed out, we make a pit stop to kill our friend Lenny, then warp back and head up the big ladder to pick up some treats. First on the list is the Infinite Titanite Shard Store Ash, and I'm not exactly sure how useful this will be because I only remember what's inside of like 4 of the mimics, but I'd rather have it than not. Then it's on to the even thicker queen prowling upstairs, whose soul is weirdly valuable given how easy he is to kill. Finally, there's a couple large Titanite shards on these lizards, meaning we can upgrade the battle axe to +4, and already we are moving on to my favorite part of every run. Beating Priestess Emma to death, because she's the thing standing between me and Lothric Castle proper, which houses a couple mimics that have my name on them. Unfortunately, this also spawns a late game boss, but for whatever reason, the dancer is actually weak to dark damage, so while our +4 axe damage isn't exactly great, it's more than enough if you've wasted as much of your life in this game as I have, and with a little caution we can whittle Dancer down and put her to bed. Now that we're up in the big leagues, I can grab all the standard late game pickups and receive my obligatory death by dragonfire on the way to reach our goal. And we do encounter some further ladder troubles and have to kill a small village's worth of people beforehand, but before long it's just us and the Mimic, one of the two weird dog ones. And after a quick fight, he drops us 3 Titanite scales, which are not actually useful to us, but it does feel good to cross him off the list. The next Mimic is right nearby though, and he's kind of a different story. We take this little drop to the left of the Dragonslayer armor boss room, and there he is. And our largely uneventful battle yields us a free Symbol of Avarice, as well as the Sunlight Straightsword, a weapon with modest damage and predominantly faith scaling, but its real value is in the weapon skill, Oath of Sunlight, which is a buff that raises both our damage and our defense for about 45 seconds, functioning similar to Sacred Oath or Elden Ring's Golden Vow. So after hunting down some Twinkling Titanite to plug in a couple upgrades, we're ready to take our new toy back to Faring Keep and try it out against the Abyss Watchers. And my insistence on being cautious really drags this first phase out, but our damage is feeling pretty solid, and as always, phase 2 is just a matter of letting Homeboy show off, then running to his rear like the little backstab gremlins we are. Then, I flip a coin to decide where to go next, and it lands on the better side, meaning it's time to head to the Cathedral of the Deep, which means that the Crystal Sage is next on the chopping block. I'll be honest, it wasn't all that interesting. But a couple NPC fights and a few teleporting dogs later, we arrive at the Cathedral. And outside of God personally interfering to rob me of a weapon upgrade, nothing in this zone gives us too much trouble. I did make the decision, however, that if we weren't going to get Twinkling Titanites here, we needed to grab them elsewhere. So I headed to my favorite little basement back at Lothric Castle, got smacked around by the Outrider Knight, and picked up the Titanite stashes. Then, since we're already here, I made the bold choice to take a couple cracks at the Dragonslayer armor. Yeah, before long I decided that the build just isn't there yet. So with a renewed feeling of hatred deep in my heart, I headed back to the Cathedral, and honestly, our sword is a little overpowered for this region now, so it's a bit of a mud stomp on the way to the next Mimic, who hides out in this little, I'm not sure what you would call this room, like a mini church, maybe a prayer chamber. If there's any Cathedral goers watching, feel free to let me know. Now this Mimic does catch us lacking, but we narrowly survive and we're able to finish the job, earning us the Deep Braille Divine Tome, which, if deciphered, would give us the Gnaw and Deep Protection miracles, which can both be very nice. The twist, however, is that no Mimics drop a chime or talisman that can cast these miracles, so this pickup is also largely worthless. There's no time to worry about that though, because it's time to put down the Deacons of the Deep, and we're doing the fight in style. Once again, you know, it's not a terribly interesting encounter. But with our small doll in hand, it's time to head towards Irithyll by way of Catacombs. And if you've heard me talk about the Catacombs before, you probably know that the region is not my favorite, so I don't spend a whole lot of time sightseeing. Also, a crystal lizard decides to simply phase out of the map for the second time this run. I fucking hate this place. But upon reaching the end, I decide that Wolnir will have to wait because there's another toothy toy box hidden downstairs. To be safe, we need to take out the demon beforehand, and Jesus Christ, this footage is pixelated, but I know you get the idea. I put on the Symbol of Avarice to see if this Mimic will mistake me for one of its own, and that obviously doesn't happen, so we kill him and are rewarded with the Black Blade, which is actually the highest base damage katana in the game, I believe, in exchange for having the shortest blade. Certainly not a terrible weapon, we will definitely be getting some use out of it. But first, we gotta do the classic Titanite run around Smoldering Lake and kill our boy Horus. We then make a brazen run into Hell itself to grab an undead bone shard, and then we leave and never come back. Quick stop at Firelink Shrine to level up enough that we can actually use the Black Blade, another stop at Lothric Castle to farm Titanite, and my word, we can get this thing up to +8, which will hopefully offset the fact that we are barely meeting the requirements to use it and are getting basically no scaling damage. And since he's right nearby, I decide to try the new weapon out on the old Demon King. And I think the damage looks good. I don't really remember what good damage is against this guy, but I do know that he kept spamming his fucking Meteor Storm attack and forcing me to run and hide, so the fight took an egregiously long time, like well over 4 minutes, which if you're not familiar with the game is an insanely long time for any one-phase boss fight to last, much less one that's generally considered pretty easy. I'm starting to think this game is upset with me in the same way that I am upset with it. But there's no time to worry about that, because it's time for the High Lord to run the jewels. We use the Sunlight Sword as a buffing stick before swapping back to the Weeaboo Slasher, and while he does his best to hide his little mitts from me, we put him back in the earth pretty quickly. Which means that we are now welcome in the city of Irithyll, but I was never much for tourism, and there are no mimics in the immediate area, so I make a bit of a beeline through the streets and water reservoir down into the Irithyll dungeon, where the next mimic can be found in his own little chamber right on the intended path. A quick buff and a heavy attack do some really decent damage, and the poor fellow really never had a chance, and he ends up dropping us an Estus shard. Pushing on, we play it safe and avoid the sleeping giant on our way into the sewer. At the back of the sewer is a mimic and a basilisk ambush. It takes me a couple minutes to safely clear out the lizards, but afterwards we can go toe-to-toe with the box boy, who drops us the Dark Clutch Ring, which increases our dark damage by 15% at the cost of reducing our physical defense by 10%. Might be handy. And then we find ourselves in the most drawn-out game of cat and mouse I have ever played. Because that's right, they put a mimic in this fucked up room full of lifesteal jailers. The strategy consisted of luring them away from the pack in 1s and 2s until I'd killed enough of them that they wouldn't really be a threat. Then we can buff up and quickly take care of the mimic, who drops us some more Titanite scales. And with him out of the way comes an absolute beast of an endurance battle. Yhorm's attack patterns are thankfully pretty simplistic, but it does take me a minute to find the right positioning to be able to hit him in the arms in the brief windows after he attacks. I'll be honest, it was a pretty messy bout overall, but unlike the last time I did this, I actually have some health on my bar, so I'm free to make a few mistakes. And with the strategy eventually getting sharpened, we finish the fight with a clear time of 8 minutes on the dot. Not too shabby. Now we can focus on the fact that there are 2 more mimics right here outside of Yhorm's boss room, surrounded by fire witches and gargoyles. And fighting multiple gargoyles at once when one of their attacks can take about half of your health is risky, so by happenstance I find myself trying to slowly whittle them down while they run into this invisible wall. Then we have to cut all the witches up, and we can move on to the good stuff. One of the mimics drops us 2 rusted gold coins, which are consumable item discovery boosters that we are not going to use. The other, however, drops us the Great Shield of Glory, which kind of feels like a joke weapon. Let me explain. When fully upgraded, it has a stability rating of 85, which is the highest of any shield in the game, though several others do come pretty close. And the higher your stability, the less stamina you use when blocking attacks, and the lower your chance of having your guard broken. So that's all perfectly good. Unfortunately, it comes at the cost of a massive 20-point debuff to your stamina regen speed, which is really, really bad. To give you a sense of scale, the Chloranthy Ring +3, which is found at the very end of the final DLC, and is considered easily one of the best rings in the game, can only make up half of that deficit. So unless you decide to craft your entire build around this one goofy item, it is not remotely worth the price of admission. But it wouldn't be fair to not give it an honest shot, so I equip it in both hands and go to work on the leftover witches. And while the ragdolling is funny, our damage output, especially considering we don't have the stats to properly wield the thing, leads me to the realization that this isn't my fight. So I decide to head home and try my hand at a duel. I'll be honest, I was hoping the shield bash would kind of launch him off the cliff, but it doesn't seem to have that same ragdoll effect against NPCs, so the master absolutely fucking obliterates us, and we have to settle for killing these hollows instead. So with that little science experiment out of the way, we can head back to Irithyll and chart a course towards Pontiff Sullivan. And my hatred towards From Software dogs is fully reignited as I get torn apart a couple times trying to get to the shortcut door. But on attempt 3, I take it nice and slow, and we get there with minimal fuss. Now the Pontiff fight is sloppy, as per usual, but bad build or not, with a +9 weapon and some points in vigor, he's just a little bit outclassed, and we can gradually wear him down and put him away. Which gives us access to the rafters above his boss room, where another mimic happens to be hiding, and he drops us the Golden Ritual Spear, which is a weapon of unremarkable melee damage, but which doubles as a staff for casting sorceries. The gimmick of the staff being that sorceries cast with it scale with one's faith instead of their intelligence. It's also the weapon that Gwendolyn, and by extension, Aldrich uses in his boss fight. But while the weapon can be pretty great for certain builds, we do not have access to sorceries, and so we're stuck with just the stabby part. We'll try to get some mileage out of it a little later. But now it's time to sprint through the rest of this area and make it to Anor Londo, where the Devourer of Gods hangs out. And Aldrich was definitely bringing a little crackhead energy, like we didn't get the best RNG possible, but our damage output is plenty solid, so playing with a little caution, we're able to hack him apart without a ton of issue, making it 3 lords down, 1 to go. But before we get carried away, it's time to go visit an old buddy. With one upgrade, the Ritual Spear does, some amount of damage, and my superior Macedonian reach makes it really difficult for him to do anything unless I get needlessly careless. So before long, we have avenged the Great Shield of Glory by continuing to not use it. Now I'm hoping to land 2 redemption arcs in a row by taking down the Dragon Slayer armor. So we hit the buff stick, swap to our damage dealer, and yeah, it's fighting him at an appropriate point in the game. So while he still gets a few good licks in, and he also pixelates the ever-loving fuck out of my footage, we cut him down pretty quickly and begin our ascent into the Grand Archives, where I think fatigue was starting to set in, as the Crystal Sage and his cronies do catch me lacking several times. But by taking a short break to pound a white monster and do 20 bodyweight squats, I'm able to increase my testosterone production and get my head back in the game. Moving forward, we prioritize grabbing upgrade materials and killing anything that's too dangerous to be left alive. When we get to the infamous gang squad guarding the rampart, I tricked the Dark Souls 2 cosplayer into falling down the elevator shaft as a show of disrespect, and then I keep my distance from them, because they're not worth our time. And because they're hard. With all that out of the way, it's right about time to meet Lothric himself and politely ask if he would like to set himself on fire for the sake of my agenda. He declines, and so murder becomes our only option. Lorien does cut us down on this first attempt early into the second phase, but our second try gets, really close. If I didn't enjoy this fight, this would have had me kind of mad, I'll be honest. By the third try, I am completely locked in, however, and even with the duo quantum tunneling across the arena to avoid taking damage, I whack him to death and take that little shit's head for my collection. But by my count, there's still 5 bosses and a handful of mimics to take care of before we can head on to the Kiln. So our next stop is back to the undead settlement for a little rendezvous with the curse-rotted Greatwood. And to make things kind of fair, I decide to wield the Golden Ritual Spear, and I learned that spears seem to be weirdly terrible at targeting the gross little pus sacks. Like, I'm pretty sure I had multiple attacks just completely phase through them. So the fight takes a bit longer than it really should when you are at level 70 fucking 8, but the reality is that the old boy can't really hurt us at this point, so we stay on the grind and eventually we put the thing to rest. The next step on our adventure is back to the Irithyll dungeon to hunt down a mimic I left behind earlier, and he drops us a second symbol of avarice in case we sprout another head, as well as 10 Dragon Slayer lightning arrows. Unfortunately, no mimics drop us a bow, and the game doesn't give us the option to throw them by hand, so you will not see these again. Which is unfortunate because the next boss on the chopping block has a rather severe lightning vulnerability. Now, for purely vibe-related reasons, Osiris has always been a personal favorite of mine, but I won't let that stop me from killing him in the most disrespectful way I know how. Also, I get a bleed proc here, which almost never happens in this fucking game, so that's kinda neat. Anyway, the dragon guy dies, and subsequently grants us access to two of the game's hidden areas. And the first that we're going to explore are the Untended Graves, home of Champion Gundyr. So we completely ignore all the additional BS and rush right to him at the cost of a few hits, and it's a decent attempt for sure, but he does absolutely floor us in the end. Then I got slaughtered by the Dex build on the next run-up, which kinda let me know I needed to lock back in after one more practice run. And then, while I definitely came close to fumbling again, close don't mean shit, and we cross Gundyr off the list. Then we head to the Flameless Shrine to grab this pair of eyes, and before you know it, we're on our way to the next hidden area, Archdragon Peak, home of the Ancient Wyvern, and, maybe some other stuff. Now you guys know how Ancient Wyvern goes, the most gimmicky of all the gimmick fights. We do our run up, and then I actually do the meme. I completely botch the plunging attack. But this ends up being a bit of a blessing in disguise, because now I can kill him with the Ritual Spear for the sake of a little more representation. And you guys know what's coming up now. We're going back to the Profane Capital, because I forgot about a fucking Mimic. He's hidden down at the Poisony Bottom in the same building as the Monstrosity of Sin, and for his death, the final Mimic death of the run, we are rewarded with the Court Sorcerer's Staff, which is one of the best staffs in the game. If you have a high-level intelligence build, this is kinda your baby. But we have the opposite of that build, so to us, it's really just a whacking stick. And consistent with the rest of the run, I take my responsibility to showcase these weapons very seriously, so we need to go find a proper target. And pretty quickly, I settle on the Crystal Lizard in the cemetery that I forgot about in the early game. So we hit our buff stick, charge in, and we do 14 damage per swing. We're going to be here for a while, but I do have to give big props to the staff's durability. I mean, I was slamming it against rock for like 5.5 minutes, and by the end, she barely had a dent in her. Anyway, now that that little housekeeping item is complete, we can go back to Dragonland, and honestly, I'm just rushing through here because we've got bigger fish to fry. We sneak through the Onslaught to grab the Dragon Chaser's ashes in case we need upgrades, and with that, it's time to ring the bell. And my fucking word, if this part didn't bring me right back to 2016. Anytime I have a build that can't just blitz the Storm Drake phase of this fight, I'm forced to remember how genuinely bad it is. Granted, even with a subpar build, sometimes you get some RNG that makes it a joke, but when it's not a joke, it is fucking infuriating. Phase 2 is probably still the best fight in the base game though, so I can't really whine all that much. My myriad of deaths while wielding the Black Blade, however, did unlock a long-buried aspect of my consciousness. The Lore Fiend, because I remembered that the Nameless King is a god, the firstborn of Gwyn, and the gods have a natural weakness to dark damage. Meanwhile, I have a +9 deep battle axe that I've been failing to use, and this gave me a bit of a second wind. So I head back in, and the damage is actually slightly worse, because it's just not a great weapon, so that dream is a bit of a wash. But not only does the axe seem to stack more poise damage, it also attacks faster and consumes less stamina than the katana, for some reason, so I still consider it an upgrade. And at this point, the attack patterns of both phases are being re-seared into my prefrontal cortex, so with just a couple more practice runs to get reacquainted with my axe, I'm feeling pretty good. And my new lack of range does lead to an embarrassing number of whiffs in the first phase, but we still managed to clear it with very little damage taken. And I do take a couple smacks early on in phase 2, but at a certain point I've seen all his tricks too many times, and there's nothing he can really do as we quite slowly tear him apart, clearing the fight in just over 5 minutes. So now, with 12 mimics and 18 bosses down, there's only one thing left to do, and we make our way to the Kiln of the First Flame, where, I guess some guy is waiting for us. And consistent with the rest of this run, it is a very messy fight. We literally go into phase 2 with no Estus to spare, and almost immediately get caught in the Gwyn grab. But despite this, and despite this guy also completely trashing my footage, Gwyn just ain't what he used to be, and we close out the fight with nothing left to spare. Then we call in the Firekeeper and shut out the lights, successfully beating Dark Souls 3 with only Mimic drops. And I'll be the first to admit that this is pretty lenient as far as challenge runs go. Really, outside of being naked, the only challenge comes in the fact that it's impossible to make the build very strong without excessive farming, because you have to spread your stats pretty thin to be able to use all the different weapons. But it was all in good fun. If you have run recommendations of your own, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you guys later.